My name is Ronna Burger. I just gave a lecture on Moses in the book of Exodus. I'm incredibly impressed with UATX students, really stimulating question period. So that was very amazing. I'm trying to give a philosophic reading. I'm interested in a philosophic reading of the Bible, and I think that Moses' role as founder and lawgiver is central to the whole biblical account. My reading of it is guided, as I was trying to show in this lecture, by three thinkers: Maimonides, Machiavelli, and Plato.
All right, good evening, polity. Our speaker tonight is Professor Ronna Burger. Professor Burger is Professor of Philosophy, Catherine and Henry J. Geisman Chair and Director of Judeo-Christian Studies, Ciesler Professor of Jewish Studies, and Director of the Religious Studies Minor, all at Tulane University. Yeah. She's the author of a number of books on ancient philosophy, most recently Aristotle's Dialogue with Socrates on the Nicomachean Ethics from University of Chicago Press. Her second book, Plato's Phaedo, A Platonic Labyrinth, will be released in a new edition from St. Augustine's Press in April, I hope. She's also the editor of a number of volumes of and on the work of her teacher, the great classicist and philosopher Seth Benedetti. And she has written numerous articles on topics in ancient philosophy and the Bible. Despite all these honors, however, Professor Burger is not, like Noah, blameless among the people of her time. She also has the dishonor of having been my dissertation advisor. Now, before I turn the podium over to Professor Burger, I'd like to say a few words on her style of reading based on my experience. Reading Plato and Aristotle with her during my graduate studies was a masterclass in noticing. Professor Burger has a rare talent for noticing every strange detail, every odd problem, things nobody has recognized in the scholarship on these works. It's a privilege to read with her. She shows by her example how poor we often are, even the smartest among us, at noticing such oddities, at noticing what a text is actually saying. It's remarkable, in other words, how easy it is for her, how difficult it is for many of us, to notice the surface of a text, how difficult it is to be superficial. And it is important, even a virtue, to be superficial, to be able to pause at every detail so that you can see things as they actually are, rather than impose on them a set of ideas foreign to the author's thinking. Nietzsche once observed correctly that diese Griechen waren überflächlich aus Tiefe. These Greeks were superficial out of depth or out of profundity. In short, Professor Burger reads like a Greek. Tonight, however, she will present not on Plato or Aristotle, but on the Bible. Is it not blasphemous to read the Bible like a Greek? Professor Burger used to begin each of her courses on Plato by announcing that she has only one assumption when interpreting the dialogues, that Plato is God. I also once heard her give a talk on the Bible, which she began by saying that she has only one assumption when interpreting the Bible, that it was written by Plato. So there's no need to worry about blasphemy, obviously. Okay, her talk tonight is called Moses as Lawgiver. I'll notice for you that the talk is not called God as Lawgiver. Please keep that in mind as you listen, and without further ado, Professor Burger.
Thank you, Alex. It's interesting when you're a teacher, you don't really know what's happening to your teaching out there, but it's been wonderful to see it reverberate in all the work that Alex Priou has been doing. And what I'm going to be talking about tonight, I've been thinking about for a long time, and I realize it goes back many years to Provost Howland, Jake Howland. I gave a talk at Tulsa many years ago when I started thinking about this. And I always have to mention Stuart Warner's Roosevelt Montesquieu Forum, where I think I first started developing these ideas. So you keep going deeper all the time. And it's wonderful to be here. Very exciting to see this institution developing. And I think it's kind of neat that I'm here talking about a founder, because you guys are founding something here. You're all founders. I'm very impressed. So thank you. I tend to interpolate too much. I'm going to try not to do that so I get through the paper and we have time for questions. I don't say questions and answers. I don't know if I have any answers. I hope you all have my handout, because I think that'll help. It doesn't really help during the lecture, and I don't know how to do PowerPoint and all that stuff. But later, look up these passages, and I think you'll want to think about it some more, I'm sure. Ponder these texts yourselves. So for that reason, I hope it's helpful. Okay, so we're talking about Moses. There are kind of like 4 parts to this paper. I have a few introductory remarks, and then I'm talking about the call to Moses' mission, the crisis he faces, and his withdrawal at the end. And I know many of you are, or all of you, or many of you are reading Exodus, so I hope this will be of interest to you. So let me start. Prelude. Divine punishment or political necessity? This is really kind of how I read the Bible in general. If the narrative of the Hebrew Bible is unified by the plot of a divine plan, that design operates almost entirely behind the backs of the individual characters, whose experiences, desires, and goals are fully drawn on the human plane. In the books of Exodus and Numbers, those 2 planes intersect in the epic tale that centers on the figure of Moses in his complex and evolving relation to God. Within the frame of this almost mythical rescue at birth and the anticipation of his mysterious death, the narrative traces the emergence of Moses as a reluctant liberator, his development as a lawgiver who founds his people by forging their enduring identity. In this epic tale, I want to mention 3 philosophers who have guided me here. Machiavelli finds the grounds to hold up Moses, along with other ancient figures of myth and history, as a most excellent model, and I think this is in your handout there, of those who have become princes by their own virtue and not by fortune. Perhaps that's a questionable designation of Moses, Machiavelli admits, as he was a mere executor of things that had been ordered for him by God. And yet, he continues, Moses should be admired if only for that grace which made him deserving of speaking with God. We'll be talking about that in a minute. This intrinsic character, which makes Moses worthy of the role that the biblical God assigns to him, unfolds in a sequence of experiences through which the founder, from the initial call to his mission, learns what his great task requires. 3 crucial moments highlight this development. The crisis of the golden calf, Moses' return to God after that event for a second transmission of the law, and finally his exclusion from the promised land at the end of the journey. My reflections on those moments are guided, as I just said, by 3 thinkers, Machiavelli, Maimonides, and Plato, whose thought can perhaps shed light on the biblical account while being illuminated in turn by the example Moses provides in different aspects of his role as founder. In the first place, Moses must lead a group of individuals just released from slavery, with no structure of association, no land of their own, compelled to wander through the wilderness facing hunger and thirst, external enemies and internal dissension, with little confidence in their guide and barely any understanding of their destination. We see it from the end, but you have to put yourself in their footsteps. Such extraordinary conditions are bound to engender crises that might call for cold-blooded decisions and ruthless deeds, which would test the prudence and determination of a leader. That is the Moses Machiavelli holds up as the exemplar of someone prepared to undertake whatever action is needed to establish his laws and orders. But leading the journey through the wilderness is only one stage of Moses' role as founder. His ultimate challenge is to mold a people through the divine law he promulgates. It is his experience as a ruler in crisis that leads Moses to realize the knowledge he needs if he's going to accomplish his task as a lawgiver. The nature of that knowledge is the issue Maimonides takes up in his interpretation of the questions Moses addresses to God as he prepares to receive the divine law for a second time. And he learns that the response he seeks can only come, I think this is such an important image, from the back of a withdrawing God. For the law to take hold requires finally the departure of Moses the lawgiver on the model of a withdrawing God who is understood to be the source of the law. This is a theme Plato develops in the dialogue devoted to the question, what is the statesman? In that work, a myth about two epochs in cosmic history. There's one in which God governs the universe and another in which he withdraws and leaves the world on its own. That myth is echoed in a political account where the statesman with knowledge, who would have to be present on the spot to control every situation, is replaced by the lawgiver, who must depart in deference to the sovereignty of the law he leaves behind. In the biblical epic, Moses leads the Hebrew people through 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, only to be excluded in the end from entrance into the promised land. Now, the absence of the founder and legislator would exhibit in a Platonic understanding of things a political necessity of life under the law. In the Bible, this fate is presented as God's punishment for a lack of faith Moses displays in a moment of weakness. And yet, in the critical golden calf episode, Moses is portrayed as a leader who grasps the political necessity he faces and the extreme response it calls for, which he can justify for his founders, it seems, only by an appeal to divine authority. After a very detailed and dramatic account of the action Moses takes, the chapter suddenly ends in Exodus with a bare statement that God smote the people, for which the narrative supplies no evidence at all. The text thus calls for two distinct levels of interpretation. One in terms of an individual human agent acting on an understanding of political necessity. The other in the moral, theological language of divine punishment. How is the relation between these to be understood? Or must God's punitive action itself be reinterpreted in light of a larger divine plan within which this moment is embedded? And how then is Moses' role as founder and legislator to be viewed in that framework? That's the end of my introductory remarks. They kind of go very far in anticipating the paper, and there's a lot to think about that probably can't be absorbed at one moment, but let's go on to the text now. So the call to his mission. Moses may be the founder of the Hebrew people, but their origin lies in Abraham, exiled from his father's house by God's command, and directed to a land where his offspring are to become a great nation with a great name. Precisely as the father of a nation, Abraham cannot be the founder, or this people will be defined solely by its status as an extended family. If its identity is to be determined in some essential way by the law, the founder has to be the lawgiver. Now, Abraham as an individual does look fit for that role at one moment when God decides to share his deliberation about dealing with Sodom and Gomorrah. And I'm sure you know the story. Abraham confronts him, would a just God sweep away the righteous with the wicked? While Abraham's negotiation does not succeed in saving the city, in the process, he establishes a principle of right and requires God to live up to it. This Abraham looks to me radically different from the one who accepts God's incomprehensible command to sacrifice his son, the son born miraculously in fulfillment of a divine promise. And I find something disconcerting in the story of that submission. God sends an angel to stop Abraham from carrying out the deed. God does not appear himself and never again speaks with Abraham after this event, although he's been so involved with him until then. Is it possible that Abraham's obedient faith is a failure of the test imposed on him? If the aim of the trial were to pick out the potential lawgiver, perhaps that requires someone ready to hold God up to a standard of humanly comprehensible justice and reason. Abraham's descendants will have to endure 400 years of enslavement before the time is ripe for the emergence of the individual who can take on that role. Unlike many legendary tales, there's a difference here I'll get to, but like many legendary tales, the story of Moses begins with an ironic rescue and change of identity. Pharaoh's edict of death to all sons of the Hebrew slaves brings about the removal of Moses from his natural family and transference to the royal family, which nurtures the future liberator it fears. We might want to talk later. In most of the legendary tales, it goes the other way around. A royal child is sent to a lower status family. In the case of Moses, it's just the opposite. To begin playing out his role in the grand scheme of the divine plan, Moses must depart from his adoptive home before returning on his mission. But this departure, even if it does belong to a greater plan, results from a deed that displays the distinctive character of the man. And I'm quoting, I think I have that in there. No, I don't have it on your hand up. It came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, that he went out unto his brethren and looked on their burdens and saw an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, one of his brethren. And by the way, it's not clear to me whether he knows that. I don't think he knows yet who he is. He looked this way and that way, I'm quoting still, and when he saw that there was no man, he smote the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Moses may act boldly out of anger at injustice, but he does look first with some caution or prudence. Still, his deed does not go unnoticed. The very next day, he discovers two Hebrew men fighting each other and tries to stop them, and one charges, "Who made thee a ruler and a judge over us? Thinkest thou to kill me as thou didst kill the Egyptian?" It looks kind of simple sequence of the story. In fact, foreign oppression followed by internal dissension foreshadows precisely the pattern of all the changes Moses faces on the path ahead. Forced to flee from Egypt, Moses reaches Midian, where he finds the 7 daughters of the priest at the well and drives off the shepherds who are preventing them from watering their flocks. Taken most likely to be an Egyptian of some rank, he earns the hand of one of the girls in marriage and names their firstborn son Gershom, for he explains, "I have been a stranger, Ger, in a strange land." In his Egyptian birthplace, he was already a stranger in a strange land. And his return there is only to lead out a group that is not yet a people of God to a homeland that is nothing but an ancient promise for the distant future. He learns of that mission while watching the flock of his father-in-law on Mount Horeb, that's also Mount Sinai. Moses first finds God, or God finds him, in the place that will mark the great peak of their association. Coming, as you all know the story, maybe from childhood, coming upon a blaze, a bush ablaze with flame but not consumed, in which the unseen angel of the Lord is present, Moses is filled with wonder and draws aside to look, I think out of curiosity. Only at that point does God take the place of his angel and call out, "Moshe, Moshe, here am I." Those words echo exactly God's last exchange with a human being 400 years earlier, when he called out to Jacob in a dream on his way down to Egypt. It's almost as if no time has intervened. God announces himself now from the burning bush. "I'm the God of thy father, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." And Moses hides his face. His first reaction is fear or awe, but his unwillingness to look is, I think, a premonition of the truth of the hidden God, which he has yet to learn. Anyway, I also don't think he ever expresses fear again, but you can check me on that, I'm not sure. When he hears what he has been called upon to do, Moses responds, "Who am I?" humbled presumably by the magnitude of his task. But the question, quite literally, is an expression of wonder about his own identity, which coincides with the question of the identity of this divine being who is called out to him. While God assures him that he will be at his side, Moses immediately begins thinking about the political problem of legitimating his authority. If he tells the children he has been sent by the God of your fathers, what is he to say when they ask, what is his name? The political problem turns into the question of the being. What is God? When God responds to Moses by naming himself with the formula of his mystery, I shall be what I shall be. Moses is to tell the children of Israel, I shall be, hath sent me unto you. He must take on the role of leader, depending on the support of a God who cannot be mastered by human knowledge of name or nature. Protesting repeatedly his insufficiency for the mission, especially in speech, Moses actually inspires God with a plan to set Aaron, his brother, as his spokesman. Now, as God himself observes, if Aaron is the prophet, Moses must be in the place of God. God concludes his first exchange with Moses by acknowledging how much he will be hidden behind his human representative. Now, in the court of Pharaoh, however, where Moses and Aaron must begin their message, their mission, they serve as the means for implementing God's design, which seems to aim at the display of divine power as much as the liberation of the Hebrew slaves. This is God's most intense intervention in human history, I think, since the creation of the universe and the flood that made possible a new beginning. Perhaps divine miracles are the only way of explaining liberation after 4 centuries of enslavement under a powerful oppressor. It is only once the children of Israel find themselves wandering in the wilderness that God begins to recede, and Moses becomes more than an instrument to carry out a divine plan. So I'm going on to part 2, the crisis and reascent. Life in the wilderness, as I started saying, is just haunted by the constant danger of hunger and thirst. And the people have no understanding of the destiny that has brought them there. They look back nostalgically to their enslavement. Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots, when we would eat bread to the full. I used to think flesh pots meant something more interesting, but I guess it's like the pots that you cook meat in. I was disappointing to learn. Their murmuring, we keep hearing their murmuring, goes on until the very end. It is not overcome by the dramatic experience that marks the climax of the journey, which comes surprisingly early, and I'm quoting, in the 3rd month after the children of Israel were gone forth out of the land of Egypt, that same day they came unto the wilderness of Sinai. While the people encamp before the mountain, Moses goes up and hears God's promise of a covenant that will make the children of Israel a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. In 3 days, God is to descend from the top of the mountain, and Moses is to ascend until they come to a meeting point. Lots of complex issues in that account of who's going up and who's not. We might talk about that later. On the appointed day, the mountain resounds with thunder and flashes with lightning. A great horn sounds out. The people tremble. God begins speaking. No audience is specified, starting with the fundamental principle of the 10 Commandments. I'm the Lord thy God, who brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. At the end, the people in great fear perceive the thunder and the lightning and the sound of the horn. Nothing is said about hearing the words of God's speech. That's another interesting topic with a lot of fascinating commentary we might want to come back to. In the terror of this theatrical display, the people beg Moses to be their intermediary. Accepting that role, Moses enters into solitary communion with God on the mountaintop for 40 days and 40 nights, until finally he is given the law in the form of 2 tablets of stone, quote, at this point, written with the finger of God. We'll come back to that. And by the way, one interesting commentary by some of you know Robert Sachs, who we lost recently from St. John Santa Fe, who looks at the number 4 multiples of 4 and 40 and 400. And this is a clear pattern. It always means a time of latency. Something is waiting to happen. And that is so interesting. 4 generations in Genesis, 40 days of the flood, 40 days on the mountain, and so on. It's an interesting numerology. While Moses is engaged in private converse with God, the narrative takes us to the camp below to witness conditions in the absence of the leader. The role of Moses as transmitter of the divine law stands in the sharpest possible tension with his role as ruler of a people in a time of crisis. They're going on 2 planes. Gathered around Aaron, the people demand, "Make us a god. This Moses who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we know not what has become of him." I think I have a quotation from Exodus 32 if you're looking at your handout. With the withdrawal of Moses, there's not even a memory of God or his role in the liberation of slavery. Aaron puts up no resistance to the people's demand. Out of the golden ornaments they give him, he fashions a molten calf and declares, "This is thy God, O Israel, who brought thee out of the land of Egypt." The backsliding of the people is a rejection of the fundamental principle of the divine law, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me," which perhaps Moses alone has heard from God. Meanwhile, back on the mountaintop, God, who sees from afar, orders Moses to go down. "Thy people that thou brought out of the land of Egypt have turned quickly aside out of the way which I commanded them. Let me alone," God demands, "that my wrath may wax hot against them and I may consume them, and I will make of thee a great nation." Moses ignores the offer for special treatment now and on all the repeated occasions when God proposes it. He seems to want to start over with Moses, and it's Moses who refuses. Moses confronts God instead with the masterful rhetoric a wise minister would use with an all-powerful tyrant. See if you can hear this difference. "Why doth thy wrath wax hot against thy people that thou hast brought out of Egypt with a great power and a mighty hand?" Each of them is trying to pawn off the people on the other, Moses and God. Moses appeals first to God's self-interest in his own reputation. The Egyptians will say that this all-powerful God brought his people forth only to slay them in the mountains. And then he reminds God of the demands of justice, which bind him to the promises he made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses assuages the wrath of God. He succeeds, but only apparently to embody it himself when he descends and sees with his own eyes the people dancing around the golden calf. His anger waxes hot, same phrase that was used of God, and he dashes the tables of stone to pieces. Now, Moses, who had complete presence of mind when hearing of these events from God, is suddenly aroused to anger when he sees the scene himself. That's, I think, all still in my handout for you. It proves, in any case, to be the greatest benefit, since the destruction of the tables of the law will necessitate starting over again in colloquy with God, which Moses will undertake with a far deeper understanding of his task. I'm kind of wondering, this is a thought I'm wondering, whether he might be imitating that anger, because it has such a powerful effect. I'm not sure he really is experiencing it. At the moment, he grinds the idol to dust and strews it into water, which he makes the children of Israel drink. In the desert, they drank bitter water. Now, the bitter water they drink is the remains of their false god. It's another episode we might want to come back to. There's some interesting reverberations of that. Turning then to Aaron, Moses hears him absolve himself of all responsibility. "I cast their gold ornaments into the fire, and out came a calf." Moses does not say a word. This is not a moral conflict, I think not, between justice and family loyalty. Rather, Moses needs his brother as a political ally. Facing the crisis of his life as leader and founder. Moses takes a stand in the gate of the camp and makes a declaration. Whoever is on the Lord's side, let him come unto me. And the narrative continues, all the sons of Levi gathered themselves together unto him. In the report of the demand for the golden calf, no division of the people was mentioned. You're not told some did it, some refrained. No division. Moses creates it now. He speaks as if he is splitting off the innocent from the guilty. But we heard of none who were innocent. Those on the Lord's side proved to be those on the side of Moses, that is his own tribe, the Levites. Moses begins speaking to them, and I quote, "Thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel. But we were just witnesses to his exchange with God on the mountaintop, a page earlier, and we heard nothing of the order Moses is about to announce. In the absence of any evidence of a divine source for this order, Moses' appeal looks like a noble lie." We can talk about noble lie later if you haven't encountered that. This is the argument Rousseau makes to explain the great challenge of a situation facing a founding lawgiver. He's going to have to put his policy into the mouth of the wisdom of a god. He has no other authority. That's also an interesting passage you guys might want to look at later. Moses issues this command to his tribesmen, and here comes his order. Quote, "Put ye every man his sword upon his thigh, and go to and fro from gate to gate throughout the camp, and slay every man his brother, every man his companion, every man his neighbor." It's kind of shocking, isn't it? What Moses instigates is not punishment of the guilty by the innocent. It's a civil war. Fratricide, or the killing of the brother, on a grand political scale. That is apparently the terrible but necessary response at this decisive moment if he is not to give up his mission altogether. This is a founding here of your institution, but you're not imitating Moses' action. I better throw that out there. The account reaches a terse conclusion. The sons of Levi did according to the word of Moses, and there fell of the people that day about 3,000 men. And I know anybody who reads the Bible in Sunday school, you don't get to that passage. On the day following the massacre, Moses tells the people that he will return to God and try to make atonement for their sin. We wonder why he did not make that effort as his first response to the crisis. When he does confront God, Moses entreats him to forgive this wayward people, or else he enjoins, "Blot me out of thy book which thou hast written," Moses says to God. Just as Moses refused God's offer to make him a new nation, God refuses Moses' offer of self-sacrifice and insists instead on punishment. "Whoever has sinned against me, him I will blot out of my book." That threat looks as if it is confirmed at the end of the episode, when we are suddenly told that the Lord smote the people, and here's the quote, "because they made the calf which Aaron made." This is an ambiguous ascription of responsibility, which raises a question about the justice of God's requital, which does not affect Aaron, who more than anyone else allowed the crisis to take place. In any case, that divine deed is never described in the biblical narrative. It fades, I think, behind the preceding account of Moses appearing to act on his own, establishing the authority of himself by appealing to the authority of God. That's what I meant by a noble lie. After the turning point of the golden calf episode, God is no longer willing to present himself with the people, and they mourn at being abandoned. Moses, on the other hand, is engaged in his most intimate association with God in the tent of meeting outside the camp. In almost shocking words, we hear that God speaks with Moses face to face, as a man speaks to his friend. Another sort of surprising line to hear. Moses comes to this extended encounter shaped by the political experience that has forced him to recognize his own ignorance. To fulfill his task as lawgiver, he now desires knowledge of the ultimate reality from which the law is in some way derived, or which it in some way reflects. If I have found grace in thy sight, Moses reminds God, show me now thy ways. This is Exodus 33 on your handout. That I may know thee, to the end that I may find grace in thy sight, and consider that this nation is thy people. That's really weird, right? It's because he has already found grace in God's eyes that he expects God to reveal himself, and yet he wants God to reveal himself in order to find grace in God's eyes. So that apparently means on a new basis, on the grounds of knowledge. Now, this is not purely theoretical knowledge desired for its own sake. It's knowledge Moses realizes he needs if his nation is to become a people of God, which is possible only if its identity is molded by a lawgiver who understands God's ways. God does not initially address Moses' plea for knowledge, but only pledges his support. My presence shall go with thee. If not, Moses warns God, do not carry us up at all. Another amazing thing. He's telling God, if you're not going with us, don't send us up. He's still concerned, as he was at the outset, with the political problem of appearing in the eyes of those he governs to have divine support. But when God confirms his promise to be present, Moses is emboldened and makes another appeal to God to reveal himself. Show me, I pray, thy glory. Exodus 33. In the two requests that Moses puts forward for divine revelation, Maimonides finds a difference of great significance. This is the hardest part. Don't worry if you don't get this. This is really hard, but very interesting to look at later in Maimonides' guide. So we had, show me thy ways, show me thy glory. The glory of God, Maimonides argues, is the essence and true reality of the divine being. But when God offers to make all his goodness pass before Moses, he is responding to Moses' first request to be shown God's ways. The ways are the attributes of God's actions: merciful, gracious, long-suffering. They characterize divine action. This is the hard part. Don't worry if it doesn't make sense, but if those attributes were in a human being, they would flow from a certain kind of character, right? A gracious character and so on. But we can't project that onto God's nature. They're not attributes of God's nature. They're just attributes of his actions. We project our human understanding onto God. That's what Maimonides is trying to get at. In the biblical text, God offers to display his goodness immediately to the declaration of his inscrutable being. I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious. I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. The knowledge Moses thought he needed cannot be granted. Thou canst not see my face and live. That really captures it, that image. No man can see the face of God. Maimonides is saying that's like trying to know the ultimate essence of reality. That's not available to us. And he goes on, the only trace we have is the vision of God's back as he withdraws. The solitary association Moses shared with God for 40 days and nights before his great political crisis is now repeated. In the end, God tells him, write thou these words, for after the tenor of these words, I have made a covenant with thee and with Israel. Originally, the tablets were written by God. Now they're going to be written by Moses. And when Moses descends, his beams of light are coming from him, from his face. The potentially blinding glory of God is now reflected in the lawgiver. Originally, the people were awestruck by the thunder and lightning. Now they're terrified by the beaming face of Moses. He must conceal himself from them as much as God did from him. Last step, the withdrawal. Moses' double encounter with God frames the episode of the golden calf. The high point of his experience as lawgiver frames the low point for the children of Israel. Their experience of neediness and anxiety in the book of Exodus is the most basic level of existence. They're dying of hunger and thirst. When the narration continues in the book of Numbers, it takes on a much darker tone. Beyond hunger and thirst, there's a new set of challenges. Moses must deal not only with a slavish people, but at the same time with a rebellious elite. In responding to the golden calf, he pitted the tribe of Levites against the others. Now, the resentment he faces against his authority comes from his fellow tribesmen, at one point from his own brother and sister. You remember I said that when he saw the 2 Hebrew slaves. Now they're saying to, who are you? Who made you a chief over us? So there's an internal, always much worse, internal dissension. This comes to a climax in the rebellion of Korah, one of the princes of the Levites, who leads a charge against the political authority of Moses and the priestly authority of Aaron. I think maybe that's a very complicated, interesting story, which I think maybe I will skip in the interests of time, but I'll just jump to this ending. In the end of that tale, there's a divine plague and 14,700 people die. I've been working with the numerology there. So if you see in the Machiavelli comment, I think the first one I have, Machiavelli is famous for this comment from the discourses, whoever reads the Bible judiciously, I really like that formula, whoever reads the Bible judiciously will see that since he wishes his laws and orders to go forward, Moses was forced to kill infinite men who, moved by nothing other than envy, were opposed to his plans. So that's, even in Mansfield's translation of the discourses and Nathan Tarkov, that's usually associated with the golden calf episode. But I think it actually fits much better this passage I'm referring to in Numbers. Infinite, right? 14,700, and they are moved by envy. It's bad, this internal strife. The princes of the people may resent the role of Moses and Aaron, but at the same time, they share in the slavishness that makes the whole generation unfit for entry into the new land. Some of you are, I'm sure, familiar with it from the book of Numbers, these spies that are sent out, right, for 40 days and 40 nights. And they go to spy in the promised land, and they see fruit and all kinds of beautiful things in the land, but they go, the people there are like giants, and we felt like grasshoppers. So all but 2 come back totally deflated, no confidence at all. And then God issues this order, this whole generation will not enter the promised land. And again, my basic theme, I'll remind you, it looks like punishment for some kind of moral failing, but I think it's God's recognition of political necessity. These people are too molded and shaped still by slavery to found a new order in the promised land. That prepares one last step here. The exclusion of that generation has its counterpart in the fate of the founder. This critical event is recounted in chapter 20 of the book of Numbers. The wanderers have reached the wilderness of Zin. In the beginning of the chapter, we learn that Miriam, Moses' sister, died there and was buried. At the end, Aaron ascends to a mountaintop where he's stripped of his priestly garments, and he dies. In between, Moses is warned of his imminent death. Once again, there's no water, and the people, full of bitterness, blame Moses and Aaron. God appears, and I think I have this on there at the end of the one of those pages. God appears and orders Moses to take his rod and to, together with Aaron, assemble the whole congregation, then before their eyes speak to the rock, which will give forth water. Moses takes the rod and he gathers the congregation as commanded, but then he expresses all his frustration and exhaustion. Hear now, ye rebels, are we to bring you forth water out of this rock? He smote the rock with his rod twice, we are told, and water came forth. Immediately God appears and addresses the 2 brothers. Because ye believe not in me, to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore ye shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. And I mean, from the very beginning, commentators this punishment seems to be so much more than the crime. so understandable, Moses' weakness. So readers have never liked this punishment. And yet, here's my last suggestion. However questionable the justice of that punishment may be, it coincides perfectly with a fundamental necessity. If the divine law is to have sovereign authority, the lawgiver cannot be present as a potential source of appeal behind its back. And I have a couple of interesting passages there in the handbook, like from Herodotus, the historian. This is a simple story, and it's so clear. He tells the story of the lawgiver Solon, who wrote the laws for Athens, and then said, I have to leave for 10 years, and you can't change any of the laws while I'm gone. And he says, I'm going for sightseeing, for theoretical contemplation, but really it's for this political reason. You can't have the lawgiver there, or the law won't be the sovereign authority. Something we really can't go into now, which Professor Priou knows very well. Plato's statesman is totally, the whole dialogue turns on this theme of how the statesman has to withdraw in favor of the law. The people must have a ruler. And the one last thing, Moses kind of understands this himself, though. He doesn't protest the punishment. And he tells God what to do. He says at the end of this chapter, you've got to appoint someone else in my place, which is going to be Joshua. The people must have a ruler, but it cannot be the founder. In imitation of God's concealment of himself, the lawgiver and founder must withdraw and leave behind what he has founded. As the last chapter of Deuteronomy confirms, Moses, the servant of the Lord, died in Moab, and no man knoweth of his sepulcher unto this day. No burial place. You can't worship Moses. Deuteronomy ends with an astonishing statement which indicates why the absence of the lawgiver and founder is so necessary. And I'm quoting chapter 34. There hath not arisen a prophet since in Israel, like unto Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, in all the signs and wonders, and in all the mighty hand, and in all the great terror, which Moses wrought in the sight of all Israel. What? Moses, not God? Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. I have like a million questions.
We'll start with one.
I'm going to start with one, yeah.
And by the way, in these conferences, when people say, or even political things, I have 3 questions. No, I say one at a time.
So you talk about Maimonides. You say that Maimonides his thesis in this case is that we project the qualities that we want to see onto God, right? At least this is the case for Exodus. If that is truly the case, or it has some semblance moving forward in the Bible, how can we expect him to then send his son, Jesus, as a perfect, sinless form of man?
I don't know exactly how I want to address the real point of your question, but I want to go back to the premise that you were. So this is really hard. You kind of need Plato and Aristotle for this. What Maimonides is doing, which he got from Plato and Aristotle, is a distinction between the essence of something, or the being, or the what it is, and the attributes. Like almost you could say noun and adjective. And he is interpreting the biblical reference to God's ways as the attributes of God. And not even the attributes of God's soul, so to speak, or character, but the attributes of his actions. And that is so much more important. It's so hard to express this. It became, by the way, a major issue in all of medieval philosophy, the divine attributes. What's so important about it is he's granting, we actually do know of God's actions from the biblical account, which of course in the New Testament becomes the incarnation. To be oversimplified vastly, you could say in the Hebrew Bible, it's God leaving himself behind in the divine law, which becomes incarnation of a human being, as I understand in the New Testament. That's a long story too. But I think the main point is so hard to understand why and some of us, you guys don't know Plato's Phaedo, do you? Anyway, it's a Platonic Aristotelian point here that maybe human beings don't have direct access to the ultimate nature of reality or the first things. We have to get at it indirectly through what we can see around us, and then think about it and examine it and try to make our way toward the what is question. Yeah. So what Maimonides is saying is, God tells us his ways are, and the stories of the Bible are supposed to illustrate long-suffering, merciful, gracious, punishment, but only to the third generation, gracious to the thousandth generation. The revelation in Exodus 34 is God revealing his ways. And I'll just leave it at this. You can think about it some more later. What Maimonides is saying is that is God's ways. That's the actions. And that's what Moses does need to be a lawgiver. He's supposed to emulate God's actions. But that's not God's ultimate essence. That remains mysterious. We better leave it at that. But you can see it's a big question. You kind of need all of Plato's thinking and Aristotle. And yeah. But thank you.
Your thesis was that that God's actions in these stories don't come from sort of cruelty. Is that correct? They're from necessity through, keeping this political body together. So how could you argue that it's not cruel for God to create or allow to be created or formed somehow this people group who require such drastic force to keep in line to instigate his will?
Yeah, isn't that always such a question, right? Why did God create human beings in such a way that they so corrupted the way of the earth in the opening chapters of Genesis that he has to try to start all over again with a flood? Why not just do it right the first time, right? And I think repeatedly in the Hebrew Bible that happens. One argument that I find very plausible is, the later tradition thinks of God as omniscient and omnipotent, all-knowing and all-powerful. And we would create perfect beings, right? Whereas I think when you read most of the Hebrew Bible that I know of carefully, at least the book of Genesis, maybe Exodus too, I think he's learning along with the human beings learning. And the way that's usually been justified, sounds right to me, is if he wanted to, this is again, Maimonides especially develops this, if he wanted to create beings with freedom, if he wanted to create human beings as free to choose, then he took a risk, right? He can't control from the start what kind of beings they'll be. And one interesting passage to me, I think real concrete version of this, after the flood, what's his name? Noah. Noah comes out, right, and gives a sacrifice to God, kind of weird. And God then says, he had said before the flood, the human heart has wicked thoughts. I'm going to start over again and create a new nature. That would be like your point. God was going to start over and create perfect beings, he thought. Then the flood, then Noah comes, and Noah was the remnant that he would use for the seed. Noah comes out and gives a sacrifice, and God says, there's just one word different. I now see that there's wickedness in the human heart from birth. And so he's now realizing he needs a different strategy, not perfect beings, but something that will guide imperfect beings. And I think that's the law. So the first law is his law with Noah.
Okay.
So, to summarize that, the simple answer is free beings have to be free. And I'll ask one last thing. In the story of creation in Genesis 1, the first chapter of the Bible, there are 2 days in which the creation is not said to be good. The second day, when the firmament that's going to divide the upper waters from the lower waters, not said to be good. And I take it that's the anticipation of the flood, or chaos, honestly. But the other one is the human being. On the sixth day, God does not say that the creation of the human being was good. And the argument many readers have given is because it's free. The human being is free. It's not determined to be good. Anyway, there's a start. Everything's so complicated, right? Yeah.
Thank you for speaking to us, by the way. So you mentioned Abraham may have failed his test with Yitzchak because his obedience was contrasting with Moshe. who checks God against the standard of human reason and judgment when God is exerting his wrath against the Levites. So my question is, how does one reconcile this conflict between what God wants, obedience versus appeal?
Yeah. By the way, I'm going to correct you. Maybe he failed the test. And I then realized I better qualify it. And I said, if he were testing for a lawgiver, that I think is really important, that there's faith, and that's not the virtue of the lawgiver. I think that's a teaching kind of, in a way, if you try to put together Genesis and Exodus. And maybe they can't be reconciled, right? I'm not sure that there is a harmony there. That there are two different virtues, you might say, two different excellences of human life, and maybe they belong to different individuals. There is an excellence of obedient faith. That's Abraham in the story of, let me also, maybe the right way I should put this is, isn't it interesting that whoever wrote the Bible, right, however it got put together in the end, God or the different, the redactor of the different layers and so on, your point you're making is already ascribed to Abraham himself. Or maybe you were saying that. Of course, I'm saying Abraham versus Moses in Exodus, but even Abraham himself. I think it's so amazing that the story of Abraham negotiating with God about Sodom is a couple chapters before Abraham accepting the command to, sacrifice his son. So whatever is going on, this is kind of a fudging answer to you, as I'm sure you'll realize, but whatever is going on, the biblical editors or authors wanted to show us two very different sides, right? I take it, and I think in reading the Bible philosophically, one should be sensitive to the puzzles or the problems that maybe, are for further reflection. And that's a big one. Those two chapters about the same Abraham are so hard to harmonize that I think it's meant to be a puzzle. So you're asking the right question. I don't know if there's more to say about it.
Could one say maybe that that appeal is a form of obedience? That you reach such a high level of obedience?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Where, Abraham, Moshe, like these people are like super, super up there. So at that point, could there just be a cross between them where it just converges and we can't really reach that point?
That's a really interesting point. I think, one interpretation I've seen is that in accepting this command to sacrifice his son, Abraham is showing such a deep level of faith that had to go through that first experience that he didn't know, I guess. There weren't 10 people, 10 innocent people. It's God knew. And he's almost deepened his faith from that. So people have tried to harmonize these two stories. And I think it would be something along the lines that you're suggesting. That sounds like the right track to me, that in appealing to God and negotiating with God, I don't know, maybe there's no way out of it. Abraham is holding up a human standard of justice. We do not punish the innocent with the guilty. It's not rational. But maybe you could read it as faith that God is rationally accessible to us, that God doesn't violate our sense of morality and reason. And that would be a kind of faith of appeal. That's an interesting point.
Thank you.
From where does Jesus pull the idea that we should love and have mercy on sinners if God is seen punishing sinners all the time?
You guys have to answer that for me, and I would love to learn what you think. I don't feel like deeply enough aware to answer that, but I would say there are, I've read things like, for example, sometimes people say, the New Testament, turn the other cheek. The Old Testament, punishment for sin, right? But actually, turn the other cheek is in the Hebrew Bible too. So again, the Bible, I don't know if you could just say it's not consistent. There's every kind of thought there. It's like probably many centuries of different authors and so on. But I think that the revelation in Exodus 34 is very interesting, right? That you get what the rabbinic tradition called 13 characteristics of God. Long-suffering, merciful, gracious, and so forth, unto the 1,000th generation. But no, the last one is punishing the guilty. And again, Maimonides brings out that that's so much, the positive 12 are so emphasized compared to the 13th, punishment. But I don't think you can read the Hebrew Bible without seeing that there is an idea of punishment of guilt. And that, another way it's often put is justice versus mercy. You probably heard that contrast too. There's something to that the God of the Hebrew Bible, there's a kind of justice. What's interesting to me and what I'm getting at in this paper and some other work I've done on these more political books of the Bible is that, in a way, the biblical God is sometimes presented more punitive than the human agent who is his representative. If you followed my paper, I was saying what looks like punishment on God's side, I believe the biblical author understood might be more of a political necessity. Anyway, there's a lot more not enough time for all these interesting ideas you guys have.
Plato highlights the importance of myth in clarifying what is true and good rather than obscuring it. And I think there's an element of the biblical tradition that can complement Plato's understanding of myth that you mentioned, which is terror, wrath, the lightning, the thunder, not merely as punishment for the wicked, but as inspiration for the righteous. And I'm wondering if myth where good is rewarded and bad punished reveal a human longing for justice, for example, or myth where sacrifice is valued reveals a social collective nature of humanity. What does terror reveal in our inherent nature? And I'm thinking maybe something like Gothic architecture tries to capture this in aesthetics in the sense that, these towering structures, they command respect. Whoever occupies them, they command some respect, reverence, even maybe fear in the institutions themselves. So what do you think terror reveals?
Yeah, that's another great question. And I got this, I was sort of inspired to these thoughts. This is where the Machiavelli input comes, I think. This is what Machiavelli really understood, that in order to put forth his new laws and orders, Moses had to kill an infinite number of men, right? And I think you do want to read the golden calf episode as punishment of the guilty, right? And yet there's really no indication. It is an act of terror, and the terror is somehow galvanizing this people. They've left the whole mission, right? The whole mission is in crisis. Moses' whole point of his life is in crisis. And he's got to do something to really terrorize this people to get them back on track. And by the way, we can't go into all this, and I don't know as much as I think people in the audience, several know more than I do, about how Machiavelli and Rousseau debate really how to understand this episode. But the idea seems to be that there might be a moment politically, I don't want to put this in personal relations, there might be a moment politically where something that seems to violate our sense of morality, but to implement terror is the only way to found a new order. You don't have authority. And I'll just mention, we might want to come back to it or read about it later. That's what Machiavelli, I think, the armed prophet, Machiavelli teaches. Whereas it's so interesting in Rousseau. Rousseau says, the lawgiver at the founding has neither force nor reason available yet. He's silently debating Machiavelli there, although he quotes Machiavelli. He's saying he doesn't have force either. I guess Rousseau means he doesn't have a state army. But Rousseau is trying to say, he's trying to replace the terror in a way. And his suggestion is that the noble lie could be powerful enough, the appeal to divine authority, that the law is coming from God, could be powerful enough to do away with the need for terror. So real interesting debate going on there.
I'm also thinking it might be essential to this absent lawgiver scenario because the terror has to live in the people who understand the myth if the lawgiver is absent.
Yeah, right? Yeah. What's going to retain this? If you persuade people at one moment, how are you going to retain that in the future? Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, in your lecture, you've showed us that it's crucial for Moses to be the lawgiver, that he needs to understand who God is.
Yeah.
However, when he asks God, who are you? He gives, and the way you've translated the name sounds even more dismissive. I shall be what I shall be.
Right.
Even if you're a little more gracious, it's like,
Right.
I am who I am.
Right.
Seems like a non-answer. How does Moses' law reflect that name of God? Why does God give him that name as the lawgiver? Why is that the
Yeah,
name?
good. I got to go back to the Maimonides point because that's the key to what you're asking, I think. And by the way, if you're going to read Socrates, right? I don't know about the Phaedo, but anyway, you're going to read about the Socratic turn at some point. That Socrates, what was Socratic? What did Socrates discover? What was his philosophy? And to put it as simply as I can, he realized that his predecessors, the original philosophers, were trying to understand directly the nature of reality. Like you open your eyes and you see white, right? They thought you could open your mind and you would see the nature of being. And Socrates says, just like if you looked at the sun in an eclipse, you would blind your eyes. You have to look at an image. Trying to look at being directly would blind your soul. You have to do it indirectly. That's what Maimonides is talking about, that you cannot see the face of God and live. That to see the face of God is to like open your mind and see the ultimate reality. We human beings can't do that. It would be blinding, or we can't do it at all. So we have to find indirect ways to do it. And Maimonides has a really clever move, taking that term in the Exodus passage, the ways of God, as that indirect way. That Moses, I shall be what I shall be, can't guide any kind of law, can't guide any kind of lawgiver. But seeing the way God acts in human history from the biblical narrative could. That's the indirect way. The withdrawing back of God is the only access we have to the divine. But Moses doesn't know what he needs. God, in that passage, knows what Moses needs to know.
So it's anti-philosophical. Not anti-philosophical, but it's like anti-structural. Moses has to walk with God to be the right lawgiver.
We don't want to call it anti-philosophic because it would be, I'm giving a reading of the Bible that makes it into a Socratic philosophic teaching here. But I think what we want to say is, it's the realization that we don't have, I kind of am repeating myself, I'm afraid, but that we don't have direct access to the ultimate nature of things. There's obscurity, elusiveness, mystery in the ultimate nature of things, either God or the beings. And so we have to find our own path to our understanding. And the Bible provides such a path in the account of God's actions in history.
Okay, that's crazy.
That's a start. That's just a start.
So if God is not omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, does the Hebrew God, does he have to struggle against other gods in the Old Testament, like the Egyptian gods?
That's an interesting question too. It's sort of, I think, again, kind of shocking and surprising the extent to which there are traces like that. So a lot of the talk about the plagues in Egypt, Pharaoh is a god, don't forget, right? Pharaoh's a god. And God does present it. It's not, we don't necessarily like hearing this, but God does present it as a kind of rivalry between, he's got to show his power over against the power of Pharaoh. Just like the magicians were trying to compete with Moses' miracles, right? The plagues and so on. Yeah, so there's that. There are traces. There's an important moment in the liturgy with the prayer starts, who is like unto thee amongst the gods? That shouldn't be in the Hebrew Bible, right? And then, there are other weird traces. Like I always wonder about, because I think it's so important, that story I said about Noah with the sacrifice. That's like straight out of a Greek myth. The smoke from the sacrifice wafts up into heaven, and God smells the smoke and then says, there's going to be wickedness in the human heart always. What? No, the Hebrew Bible shouldn't be having God smelling the smoke of an idol, of a sacrifice. But I would say the most interesting thing to me, which I do not understand, are angels. What are angels doing in the Hebrew Bible? They should not be there, right? What are they? That's really obscure. I think it's but it's somehow, they're some kind of divine-ish beings. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, and then there's, by the way, one last thing. One of the few humorous, or I don't know about few, but a very humorous moment of the Bible is in Numbers with the Baal, the sacrifice in Numbers to Baal, really made fun of, like, maybe your God, he's not consuming the flame. Maybe he went out to lunch or something like that. Yeah, so there are various, I think the scholars say that they're almost fossils of more ancient sources, but yeah.
All right, thank you.
You read that passage in which Moses is described as a stranger in a strange land, having left Egypt and gone to Midian.
Yeah.
As a kind of a double strangeness of Moses's.
Yeah.
But could it also be read as evidence of his Egyptianness? That Moses, because he has to leave Egypt to be the stranger in the strange land, and he has this Egyptian name after all, is maybe more Egyptian than we like to think as the father of the Hebrew kind of people.
Really, so true. But Professor Howland and I were talking about Moses, Freud's book, Moses and Monotheism. I don't really approve of it, but it's an interesting book. He tries to make the claim that Moses must be an Egyptian. It couldn't have come from, and then there's a lot of reaction against that. That wasn't well received, that thesis. But he's very Egyptian. He's been raised in the royal household. As I said, even in those opening scenes, it's not clear that he knows he's one of the Israelites. So maybe, I don't know. But I think that this is kind of a common idea of the revolutionary leader coming from a different class than the people he's going to lead. I mean, Moses had to be educated. No slave was going to undertake this mission. So he had to really be Egyptianized. There's so many interesting things. One of them is the way Genesis ends. I said that thing that God calls out to Jacob. God never speaks to Joseph. Very interesting to me. He never speaks to Joseph in Genesis. One of the last chapters of Genesis, he speaks to Jacob and says, you can go down to Egypt in the dream. Jacob, Jacob, where art thou? Here am I. Same words as the 400 years later to Moses. So the going down to Egypt through the story of Joseph is one frame, one bookend, that then is picked up in the beginning of Exodus with the enslaved people that we hear have been there for 400 years. So, if I go really abstract, I think there's an abstract theme about exile too. Homeland and exile, very paradoxical in the Hebrew Bible. It's in a way all about the homeland and the promised land. But even I would say from the Garden of Eden is a story of exile. You have these, these symbolic human beings in the Garden of Eden have to be expelled, have to be exiled. And then, there's a lot more we could add to that, but I think you're right.
Thank you.
Hello. You mentioned in one of your answers earlier that God is essentially learning on the job, just as we are, which is a good answer to the problem of theodicy. And you also said that God gave us freedom and free will, which is why we have evil in this world. But what is your answer to the issue of evil or natural disasters that are outside of human control?
I have a non-biblical answer to that. I've been fighting for a long time with a colleague who thinks that in these natural disasters, like let's say we go through hurricanes in New Orleans, right? And it looks like unfair. Tornadoes are great or as examples because, this house is it and not that one. It's unfair, right? Or disease is unfair, it's unjust. And I think, this is my Platonic answer to your question, that nature isn't about, there's no justice or injustice in nature, right? You are projecting something onto nature. Nature is operating according to necessity, the natural laws, right? And it's unfortunate, some of the consequences that happen as a result, but it's not a matter of justice and injustice or punishment. It's not about punishment. And that's very interesting and very hard what the biblical stance is toward that. I'm wondering, I kind of want to resort to my main theme, but I better think of a good example for you that I don't have off the top of my head now. I'm going to keep thinking about it. But my main theme would be, in most of the Bible, yes, the stories are presented as God's intervention punishing. The flood, right? What could be better? And of course, the scholars say there was a Babylonian story about the flood. Floods happen. The Bible presents it as God's punishment, but his love of the people, and he's going to save them. But I think that I attribute to the biblical authors, I think I have enough evidence to attribute to some biblical authors an understanding that that's a presentation of, it's a rhetorical appeal to God's punitive justice, when there's really an understanding that necessity and chance govern a lot of human life.
Okay.
I don't know if that's a start of a help.
Is it a contradiction to say that the just God has created a world whose nature is unjust and randomly assigns death to people who receive them not because of the free will of others or the free will of God?
Yeah. Okay, so first I'm going to, this might sound petty, but I'm going to say I wouldn't call it unjust.
Okay.
There's misfortune, right? Misfortune. I wouldn't call it unjust, the natural occurrences. But, by the way, the most interesting thinker I know about this, or one of the very one, Maimonides he's talking about divine providence in the Guide of the Perplexed, and he gives a really interesting, elaborate account of, I think, 3 different Islamic views, and the view of our law, which would be the Torah, and his own view, which obviously he's separating from the divine law of the Hebrew Bible. So I think he gives 5 different accounts, all different ways of addressing your point. Like one of the extremes is God is so involved that nothing is random. If you step on an ant, God was really behind that to punish that ant for something, right? That's one extreme view. The other is which he attributes to Aristotle. There's no particular, God isn't involved in particular things at all. God's not involved in particular human beings even. And then our law is God is involved with particular human beings, but not the other species. As you can see, I'll just leave it at this. There's a huge issue and question there that some really intelligent traditions have wrestled with, different ways of trying to address your question, I think. So,
thank you.
People are amazing. I'm going away really impressed. I think that was quite a workout. Really very interesting questions, and all still to be thought about. Email me if you get any more ideas to answer the questions better than I did. And read these passages. Thank you all.